everybody, and just in case that skipped a little bit, hello everybody and welcome to Creep Tales Reviews. This is going to be a different playlist on my series. I know I add those a lot, but I'll be your host, Brisk Midnight. For this episode, we will be covering my absolute all-time favorite creepypasta so far, other than Cupcakes. It is called The Apple Sleep Experiment. And I'll also be covering the subparts that have also come out, another Apple Sleep Experiment, part 1, 2, and 3. Part 3 was just released today, and so far, I honestly, after listening to part 3, I feel like she should add, because this series is covered by, or is either created by or like narrated by the lost narrator. I don't know if she herself created this story or if it's a pre-made creepypasta, but either way, the story's fantastic, and I wanted to do a kind of a live reaction. It's not the first time I've heard it, obviously. I've already told you I've listened to all of them. Repeatedly, I've listened to the first one until another Apple Sleep Experiment came out, and then I continuously watched parts 1, 2, and 3, and they are all fantastic. So I will be reviewing part 1 for you, which is an Apple Sleep Experiment, which is the very first part to the series. Let's get right into it.
The following reading contains subject matter that some listeners might find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Gotta get some of that dirty bean water. Pour out to Jack's up.
Applejack wiped the sweat from her brow as she and her brother, Big Macintosh, hauled their last cart of apples towards the barn. It had been an unbearably hot afternoon in Sweet Apple Acres, and Applejack wished for nothing more than to put her hooves up and enjoy a cold mug of cider.
"Can you get the last bushel to the other end of the barn, Big Mac?"
Applejack asked. On any other day, she might not have let on that she needed help, but she was far too hot and sore to worry about her pride.
Yup,
Came his short reply. Big Mac was also drenched with sweat, but somehow maintained his grin and calm demeanor.
Ooh-wee, that's some sort of weather we're having, ain't it? I hope it's a mite different when the Zap Apples get here. Not sure they'll be able to stand it with this kind of heat.
Applejack said, breathing a sigh of relief when she was finally able to release the harness of the apple cart she was carrying.
yup.
"See you inside, Big Mac."
Applejack said, already out of the barn door as she bade him farewell. Applejack's iconic hat seemed to offer no relief from the sunlight on her trek back to the house. Tired, sore, and irritable, her only solace for the day's labor was the thoughts of refreshment and relaxation. However, when she rounded the corner, she spied a familiar-looking carriage with the iconic dollar symbol on the side, the trademark of the business tycoon Filthy Rich. 2 earth ponies harnessed to the carriage nodded in her direction as an informal greeting, and Applejack warily nodded in return. She wondered why Filthy Rich would be visiting the farm so soon, as he usually only appeared when the Zap Apple Jam was prepared and ready for sale. Applejack was surprised to see the front door open and peered inside suspiciously. She found Filthy Rich talking to Granny, who was sitting in the corner looking timid and frail, curled up on her rocker with a tremble in her hooves. It didn't take long for Applejack to understand that this was not a pleasant visit.
You owe a great deal more than that, Granny Smith, and I, for one, would hate to see you lose this farm.
Filthy Rich said, all manner of pleasantry gone in his tone. Granny Smith looked up at him with wide and pleading eyes, but before she could answer, Applejack came to the rescue.
"What in darnation are you talking about?"
Applejack asked sternly. She narrowed her eyes and glared at Filthy Rich, protective instincts taking priority over common sense.
I just want to point out, if this is a handmade creepypasta, and if she had somebody like helping her with the artwork or whatever, I just want to comment, artwork, fantastic. Did a great job.
Granny here is in quite some debt with me, young Philly.
Also?
And it's high time I'm paid.
Also, voice acting, spot on. I love the voice acting so far. The voice for Applejack, nailed it. Voice for Filthy Rich, nailed it. Like,
Get my money.
The Apple family hasn't borrowed money from you in ages.
Applejack protested, stomping towards him with a growl.
Now hold on there, Applejack. That ain't quite true, young'un.
Nailed it.
Applejack broke her glare to look at Granny in confusion.
What do you mean, Granny?
Well, I didn't want to worry you none, but
Like-
this season has...
For all of those who are trying to start like creepypastas and whatnot, I highly suggest that you follow The Lost Narrator. Perfect example of what horror and like what horror storytelling to a more innocent seeming type of genre. This is exactly what it should look like. Like, perfect example. Great storytelling, great narration, great artwork, voice acting. It's all just, you nailed it.
been too kind on Sweet Apple Acres, and we've been needing an extra bit or two to keep up with work demand. It's a bad weather spell is all, it'll pass.
That may be so, but what has passed is my deadline. What with interest and everything, I'd say you'd owe about half of your farm's worth by now.
Half the farm? Granny, why didn't you tell me we were hurting for money?
Now, Applejack, this here is my business, so don't you worry none. You're a reasonable pony, Filthy. Can't we work something out?
I believe I may know just the thing.
Filthy said, calming his speech a little and straightening his necktie.
Just a moment. That was weird. Very weird.
I think I could overlook this little debt of yours if you gave me twice the amount of Zap Apple Jam this year.
But you already take half.
Precisely.
Wait a minute. You want to take our entire supply of Zap Apple Jam this year? We need that money along with the solder sales just to keep this family going during the winter.
Well, the way I sees it, y'all don't have much of a choice now, do you, Missy?
You can't actually be considering this. Can you, Granny?
See, I feel like, okay.
I'll be by in
Hold on.
2 weeks.
Oh, I feel like the only reason Filthy got away with this situation right here is because A, they didn't have a written contract of what was like negotiated, like their deal of how much she owed. I feel like that borrowing of money or helping her out was not recorded on a document. And so that's the only reason he can get away with this right now is because it was all under the table. So, nice detailing there.
For my product.
Filthy Rich said, having already considered this a done deal.
And I'll be counting them jaws too, so don't go thinking y'all can just hold out on old Filthy Rich. I get every last jar, or this farm goes into foreclosure, you hear?
Applejack was stunned into
And
silence.
this is not me
Filthy
bashing
Rich
on the
cleared
story, but I do just want to point out that even if he did count the amount of jars at the end of processing, he wouldn't be able to know if he got every single jar just because of the simple fact he doesn't know how much product is made every single time. And if he does, I bet you anything he has somebody else that keeps track of it, and so he doesn't personally know the numbers and wouldn't be able to tell even if she did keep a few jars. Considering the fact that, well, I won't spoil it.
his throat a couple of times until she snapped out of her trance and realized she was blocking his exit. With his head held high, Filthy Rich left the farmhouse with a sarcastic
Good day.
Applejack waited until he had gotten into his carriage and was out of hearing range before she confronted Granny again.
What are we gonna do if we don't get those Zap Apple Jam earnings this year? We can't pay off a debt if that means we'll be hurting for money in the winter months.
Your Granny Smith always thinks of something, Applejack. You just worry about harvesting those Zap apples and leave the rest to me, you hear?
Granny said, offering her an apologetic smile. Applejack didn't reply. Instead, she looked back outside the open door to see the sorry state of the apple trees, baking under the unforgiving heat of the sun. If the rain stalled much longer, she knew her family's troubles were only going to get worse.
And I just want to point out, this is when the show would have normally given Applejack the opportunity to do like some side work to make some more extra cash for
As
his family.
predicted, the next day saw no improvement for the Apple family. Things had taken a sharp turn for the worse, and Applejack resigned to the fact that she couldn't solve this issue on her own. She raced from Ponyville Hospital to consult the only pony she knew that could figure her way out of this mess.
Twilight?
Applejack called, letting herself into Twilight's castle.
Are you in there? I need your help.
It wasn't too long before Applejack found the princess pacing in the library. She noted that Twilight looked a little more haggard than usual. There were beads of sweat along her brow, and her usually kept mane was hastily tied in a ponytail to keep it off of her neck. In that moment, it dawned on Applejack that even royalty were victims to the unusual weather, and that wasn't a good sign.
Applejack? What is it?
Twilight asked, snapped out of her pacing by her friend's entrance.
It's a lot of things, really.
She hid the dark circles under her eyes with her hat, hoping she didn't look as dreadful as she felt.
I came to you because I don't have any other option.
Tell me what's happened.
Twilight said, her voice edging on a strange combination of concern and impatience.
First things first, have you heard anything from Rainbow Dash regarding the weather?
Twilight let out a frustrated sigh. Apparently, that was not the right question to ask.
No, it seems Ponyville isn't the only place suffering this heat. There's a terrible drought all over Equestria. I've heard that Rainbow production...
I'm gonna do something real quick. And we are back.
Not the right question to ask.
No, it seems Ponyville isn't the only place suffering this heat. There's a terrible drought all over Equestria. I've heard that Rainbow production has completely shut down for the time being. It seems Pegasi are having a hard time finding enough water to make clouds, let alone rain.
I was afraid of that. And the princesses? What do they say?
Princess Celestia and Princess Luna are looking into a spell that can allow salt water to be transformed into rain clouds. For some reason, it doesn't process the same in Cloudsdale's weather machines. If a spell can be found in time, the water from the ocean will save us. But until then...
Twilight stated, but trailed off at the end, so Applejack came to the terrifying conclusion on her own.
I offered to help, but they said I'm needed here instead. I've been scouring my books for anything weather-related, but so far, nothing's been remotely useful.
Twilight said, gritting her teeth. She hated the thought of being unhelpful in a time of crisis.
Well, I sure need you.
Applejack offered, wishing she could smile in comfort, but unable to do so given the nature of her visit.
It's Big Mac. He got wind of Granny's debt to the Rich family, and he worked himself to the bone harvesting apples. I think he was hoping to make some extra money before the Zap apples got here. Darn fool was out in the sun so long he went and got himself sick with a heat stroke.
What? Is he...
He's gonna be all right. Doctor says he's got to stay in the hospital for a few days.
Wait. If Big Mac's too sick, that means... the Zap apple harvest. He isn't going to be well in time, is he?
That's precisely why I'm here.
Oh, Applejack. I want to help. I really do, but...
I know, Twi. You've already got a lot on your plate. I don't come asking for your help like that.
Then what do you need from me? Anything I can do to help, I'm happy to do it.
I seem to recall a spell you said you had been working on. If I remember right, it was supposed to help you stay up studying on the nights Princess Celestia gave you those ridiculous reading assignments.
Yes, but how will that help you?
Well, I may not be studying late into the night, but I need to figure out a way to stay awake long enough to get all those zap apples harvested.
Oh, I don't know, AJ. I haven't perfected that spell yet, and I have no idea what kind of side effects it might have. Besides, you'd be using it to keep up your strength. All I needed it for was to stay awake a couple more hours for reading.
Why? I wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary. Granny's gotten us into quite a financial pickle, and if I don't meet Filthy Rich's quota, I could lose the farm.
Applejack admitted, unable to conceal the panic in her tone. Twilight furrowed her brow and opened her mouth to protest, but was unable to find the right words. Feeling the pressure of the situation and the frantic pleading in her friend's voice, she knew she couldn't refuse.
I hope you know what you're doing, Applejack.
She cautioned, leading her friend from the library to retrieve her spell. The sun's heat showed no remorse on the day of the Zap Apple harvest. Despite the severity of their situation, the Apple family found it difficult to gain any outside assistance. Most of the extended Apple family was tending to their own dying orchards, and Applejack's friends all had places to be. Still, there were a few kind Ponyvillians willing to lend a hoof, though most of them didn't last more than a few hours under the sun. By the day's end, only Apple Bloom and Applejack remained. When the sun finally set over the horizon, Apple Bloom collapsed on the ground, grateful that the heat would finally subside. Although Applejack felt her own looming exhaustion, she was too stubborn to give up the work. She looked at a few bushels they'd collected, and then at the remaining Zap Apple trees, realizing that despite their hard work, more than half of the bucking was left to do. Soon after sunset, Granny Smith emerged, struggling as she walked with what appeared to be 2 glasses of lukewarm cider.
Sis, are you coming in? Granny says there's fresh pie inside.
Apple Bloom asked her older sister warily.
No can do, Apple Bloom. I was hoping we'd get through more of the trees before sundown. You know as well as I do that these disappear at midnight.
Now, Applejack, we done our best. Besides, I can tell you're about to drop, young Billy, and I'm not about to have another grandchild in the hospital from exhaustion.
That ain't gonna happen, Granny. Y'all go on ahead. There's still a few more minutes of strength left in these here legs of mine, and I want to make sure we get all the Zap Apples we can get.
Applejack said, walking away from them. Applejack knew it worried Granny to see her working this hard, but she also knew she couldn't risk letting on how important this was with Apple Bloom around. Thankfully, every pony had kept quiet about their finance problems around the little filly. As Applejack wandered from one tree to another, she could feel the contents of her saddlebag moving in rhythm to her steps. Somewhere, buried beneath her supplies, was a little potion vial that hopefully had the answer to her problems. When Twilight produced the sleep preventative potion the previous day, it came with a strongly emphasized condition. Applejack had to promise to use this as a last resort, an absolute last option. Twilight was worried that the side effects might cause more damage than what it was worth, as she hadn't had time to truly study them. Applejack could see the genuine concern in her friend's expression, and gladly made the promise, even knowing full well that she intended to use it. Still, staying true to her word, Applejack gave the Zap Apple bucking her best effort without it. It was an hour or so after sunset that she could feel her body threatening to shut down. Her muscles tensed up, and her vision became hazy, causing her coordination to suffer. Although the sun was long gone, beads of sweat were still rolling off her cheeks, and her breathing became raspy and short. In her rapidly escalating exhaustion, Applejack made a miscalculation in her bucking and ended up being pummeled to the ground with Zap Apples. She groaned and put a hoof to her throbbing head, shaking some apples loose from her hat. Applejack heaved a sigh as she carefully pulled Twilight's potion out of her saddlebag and held it up in the moonlight.
I'm sorry, Twi, but I've got to save the farm.
She pulled the cork free from the potion vial and downed it in one gulp. However, the moment she drew the vial away from her lips, she felt a wave of unbearable sickness. Clasping her mouth with her front hooves, she turned away from the zap apple trees before the potion and most of her dinner came back up with a vengeance. Apple Bloom awoke just after sunrise when she heard a crash coming from the kitchen. She wiped the sleep from her eyes as she quietly trotted downstairs to see what was happening. When she entered the kitchen, she was surprised to see row upon row of jars filled with freshly prepared zap apple jam. Somewhere hidden behind them, she could see the outline of her older sister, who was busily stirring the current pot of jam while simultaneously measuring out the correct amount of honey.
Sis?
Apple Bloom, what in the hay are you doing up so early?
I heard a crash.
Apple Bloom said. She maneuvered her way into the kitchen, making sure not to knock over the precariously stacked jars.
How long have you been up? How'd you make all this jam?
Once I got a little more focused, the rest was easy. Don't you worry none, little sis. I'll have all the jam jarred and ready for sale 2 days earlier than expected. Then we can be done with all this financial nonsense. He'll get his over all right.
Applejack said, speaking so quickly it was hard for Apple Bloom to hear or understand what she was saying. Apple Bloom took a step back and accidentally hit the kitchen table where a complete jar of jam wobbled and threatened to fall. Apple Bloom gasped and tried to catch it before it hit the ground, but Applejack beat her to it, swiping the jar from midair and settling it down on the ground before hurrying back to the jam she was making. Apple Bloom blinked a couple times in awe of her sister's speed and agility. Had she always been this focused?
How many jars do you think you've got here, sis? I don't recall making this much jam last year, and we weren't even able to get most of the trees yesterday.
Oh, I finished the bucking too.
Finished the bucking? On your own? All of them?
Yep, we'll have more jam this season than ever before.
But when do Granny and I get to help make the jam?
You don't have to worry about that this year, little sis.
I need to write it.
I got you covered.
I should put mostly. I just want to point out for everybody who's watching right now, the Apple Family Orchard has been covered in the show as a 3-part orchard. There is a west section, an east section, and a middle section. She just stated that she had completely finished the bucking, which means the entirety of the Apple Family Orchard. She cleared in one night, after already being previously exhausted. So let's just keep that in mind as we continue the story.
But Granny promised.
The thing is, Apple Bloom, Granny's got a lot on her plate now with Big Mac being gone, and I just figured that I can get the jam done a whole lot faster.
But it just ain't fair. I already told the Crusaders they could come and help out with this year's batch.
Sometimes you can't have what you want. That's just how life goes.
But-
Apple Bloom, I'm not arguing about this now.
But Applejack...
I said no!
Applejack screamed. She turned to Apple Bloom and growled with a slight twitch in her eye. Apple Bloom felt the pit of her stomach drop and backed away from her nervously. She had never seen her sister so angry before, and it frightened her. After a moment or so of silence, Applejack blinked a few times and shook her head, returning to the pot of jam.
I was just gonna ask if I could help you.
Apple Bloom whispered. Applejack paused for a moment and looked back at her little sister with a frown.
I'm sorry, sis. Why don't you just run along and play instead? I'm doing just fine on my own.
Applejack said, the tone in her words letting Apple Bloom know that the decision was final. Defeated and slightly hurt by her sister's words, Apple Bloom left the kitchen while fighting back a sniffle.
And right there seems like a perfect place to pause for just a moment and cover some of the things that I wanted to talk about. So in this part of the story, they're not only trying to come up with a solution to the drought that they're fighting, but Big Mac's in the hospital with heat stroke, was told that he's going to be okay. Twilight had given her a potion without knowing all the side effects, was very hesitant about it and very suspiciously apprehensive that she'd take it in the first place, but yet still gives it to her best friend, like somebody who's supposedly her best friend. Even though being very suspicious about how she was putting it, like, you can tell from the very beginning that she's kind of being sussy about how she talks about the potion, because she's like, oh, but I haven't, like, tested it all, but yet, you know, here you go, but be sure you only use it as, like, a very last resort. Like, I don't, you can see how adamant she is about her not using it, but yet with how apprehensive she is to giving her the potion, she still does it anyway, even though, and I know this is just so the story can happen, but, like, even though knowing that there was probably other ways she could have went about helping Applejack, she still decided to give her this potion that she wasn't fully aware about. And usually Twilight would be accepting of her choices. I'm just going to leave that part right there. We can very plainly tell that Applejack was, like, absolutely exhausted by the time she had taken the potion. And exhaustion can do crazy things to somebody, so the fact that she was pre-exhausted to everything that's about to take place is probably a huge factor in how the potion had affected her. I just want to drop that. After consuming the potion, we can very immediately tell that Applejack has gone from exhausted to very erratic behavior, very sporadic motions, and erratic movements. Like, she's being very fast and agile and doing things that she normally wouldn't do when somebody would be, you know, previously exhausted. And then, after completing the bucking of a 3-part orchard, she is also having violent mood swings after consuming the potion. So there's also that little bit of information. So we can already rule out 3 side effects of this potion, which is erratic behavior, violent mood swings, and a burst of energy. Like, it gives them stamina. It's like a stamina boost. So,
My, that is mighty impressive, young filly.
Filthy Rich watched in delight as his staff loaded the jars of jam into his cart.
It's nice to see a little hustle these days.
And the debt? Applejack asked, finding it difficult to remain still as she stood beside Filthy Rich.
Repaid in full, as far as I'm concerned.
it's also
Good.
antsy.
Applejack said, rubbing her right front leg with her left. She could feel the tremor in her body and was aching to get some more work done.
400 jars of jam for the debt repaid.
Beg your pardon.
400 jars. That was the deal. Twice your order from last year.
I believe I said every jar of jam, young filly.
Now, I know you're a reasonable pony and all. You know that if we don't get the sales from the Zap apples, we'll be hurting again in the winter months. I figured since you had gotten your order so quickly, you wouldn't mind us holding on to a few jars.
I appreciate your business sense, Applejack, but a deal's a deal. Even with the extra jam, that debt would still be technically underpaid.
Not really.
I'm doing you a favor,
If you did the
and
numbers
all I
on-
ask is for the jars I was promised.
Applejack's heart was racing, and her blood pressure was increasing rapidly.
Now hold on just a minute. That ain't fair and you know it.
Ain't about being fair. It's about knowing how to conduct business.
Applejack stamped her hoof in frustration, but Filthy Rich held out a hoof to stop her before she could say anything else.
Tell you what, I'll let you buy back some of your jam. Half price. For personal use, of course. And if you're hurting for funds by the winter months, then y'all know y'all can come back to old Filthy Rich.
Get some more.
Applejack snorted angrily. Her legs began to quake and her eyes narrowed. Though she would have liked nothing more than to cuss out Filthy Rich, she clenched her teeth shut instead. Without another word, she stomped towards the orchard, each hoof step beating against the ground in anger. Apple Bloom, Scootaloo, and Sweetie Belle remained hidden behind a bush nearby, trying to understand what they had seen.
It can't be true. It just can't.
Apple Bloom said, not wanting to believe what she was hearing. Sweetie Belle threw her hooves around her friend in a hug until Scootaloo interrupted them.
Guys, I think there's something off about Applejack.
What do you mean?
Well, she seems kinda mad.
Of course she's mad. That greedy stallion won't even let us keep a single jar. And after she worked so hard, too.
Yeah, but I'd be mad too. I can't believe Diamond to Your Eyes gonna have this told over our heads. Reformed or not, she'll never let you live this down, Apple Bloom. Guys,
Scootaloo said, her eyes growing wide.
I ain't gonna give her the satisfaction. I say we grab a couple jars and hide them before Mr. Rich can get them all from the house.
yeah, guys.
What is it, Scootaloo?
Apple Bloom started, but was cut off when she followed Scootaloo's gaze. Applejack was bucking an old apple tree angrily, kicking.
And we are back. Sorry about that.
Guys! What is it, Scootaloo?
Apple Bloom started, but was cut off when she followed Scootaloo's gaze. Applejack was bucking an old apple tree angrily, kicking it so fiercely that it was beginning to weaken. The three fillies could hear the unmistakable sound of the trunk cracking, so they raced from their hiding place to call out a warning. Applejack couldn't hear the filly's cries. She was lost in her rage, imagining that instead of bucking a tree, she was bucking the tar out of a certain greedy business pony. She could see his smug grin and the selfish gleam in his eyes reflected in the tree trunk. She panted and sweated as she bucked, so focused on getting out her frustrations that she didn't realize the tree was falling apart. Branches cascaded down and left little cuts in her fur as they fell. However, Applejack remained unfazed, unable to feel the slightest bit of pain. Soon after, the image of Filthy Rich on the tree began to laugh, as if to mock her efforts to take out her anger. Although her back hooves were physically unable to handle the amount of stress she was making to perform, she didn't care. All she could think of was bucking the smile right off that pony's face. Right off that pony's face. Apple Bloom and the other Crusaders were only a few yards away when they heard the terrifying crunch. At first, they believed that Applejack had actually managed to buck down an entire apple tree. But upon closer inspection, they realized the sickening truth. It wasn't the tree that had cracked, but the bones in Applejack's back legs. They were unmistakably visible under Applejack's skin, jetting out to the side and causing her hooves to turn the wrong way. Sweetie Belle screamed in surprise, and Scootaloo lost all color in her cheeks. Apple Bloom was frozen in place, horrified at what she was witnessing. Meanwhile, Applejack's ears were ringing, and she felt a wave of nausea as she attempted to buck the tree again. This time, however, she felt a tremor in her body when her hooves made contact with the bark. She didn't realize the feeling as pain, and it only served to confuse and anger her more. As she tried to buck again, the ringing in her ears only got louder, and her vision began to blur. Contact with the tree sent a wave of shock through her body, and she felt her muscles tense and freeze. Applejack stumbled to the ground, still oblivious to the broken bones. She looked up at the tree, but no longer recognized it to be anything other than Filthy Rich, towering above her and delighting in her defeat.
Applejack?
Apple Bloom cried, averting her gaze from her sister's back hooves.
Applejack!
She screamed again. Applejack was unresponsive, still staring intently at the apple tree. Apple Bloom caught the look of fear and anger in her sister's eyes, then looked at the tree in confusion.
Applejack? I'll get help.
Scootaloo offered, taking the opportunity to get as far away from that place as possible.
Quit your laughing!
Applejack gasped. Her voice cracked as she spoke. She attempted getting back up, but each time she tried, she faced a new wave of nausea and unresponsiveness. Applejack felt some pony tugging on her front hoof and turned to see Apple Bloom hovering over her. Apple Bloom was saying something to her, but all she heard was muffled shouts with no meaning and a loud, unyielding ringing in her ears. She tried once more to get up, but Apple Bloom protested, pointing to her back hooves. Applejack propped herself up to see what all the fuss was about, and
Sorry about that, guys.
realized something had happened. She tilted her head to the side, wondering why she hadn't felt any pain. Even now, she failed to see the marred state of her fur, caused by the fallen branches and debris. Apple Bloom shouted something incoherent again and ran away. As soon as she left, the ringing in Applejack's ears waned. With what conscious thought she had left, she pulled a few branches within reach closer, looking for a few thick and sturdy ones. Her head was swimming, and she felt wave after wave of nausea, but wasn't deterred from her task. When she found what she needed, she pulled her useless back legs in front of her and laid them as straight as she could manage. Her heart was still pounding rapidly in her chest as she calmly searched for some rope in her saddlebag. She'd never set a bone before, but she wasn't willing to wait useless on the ground until some pony found her. She positioned her front hooves over her leg and applied pressure. When she heard the snap, she winced in anticipation and felt a shiver run down her spine, but no pain followed. The second leg was even less of a shock, despite the multiple snapping noises she heard. Once she properly tied her makeshift splints to her legs, she pulled herself up, using the strength in her forehooves. Now, she just needed to figure out a way to make it to Ponyville Hospital across town.
There are lots of cute chucks and canvas shoes out there, but none are
Applejack stared unblinking at the ceiling of the hospital. She'd grown irritated rather quickly by the staff, who both marveled and chastised her for making her way to the hospital without assistance. When she attempted to explain the situation, she found it difficult to recall any detail. All she could remember was the fury she felt for Filthy Rich, and the senseless beating she gave him afterwards. She continually demanded to see him to make sure that he was all right. She must have really done a number on him to break her legs like that. He was a lot stronger than most stallions she knew. In fact, she thought the only other pony who might be able to withstand a beating of that caliber was her older brother. Wasn't he in this hospital too? Applejack's thoughts were louder than she remembered them being. Sometimes she couldn't hear the doctors or nurse ponies over their frantic buzz. She wasn't sure how long she had been in that hospital bed. She recalled having some pony tell her
she needed to rest,
but sleep wouldn't come.
it had been over 24 hours, hadn't it?
Wasn't Twilight's potions supposed to wear off by then? That Filthy Rich pony must have been in a lot of trouble.
She wondered how much of a beating he had actually taken. You know what? She should really try and see him.
Maybe when the nurse ponies come in again, she'll ask.
She forgot to mention that he still might be in the orchard, in pain somewhere. He deserved it, though.
Especially for his insatiable greed.
For some reason, she thought Apple Bloom was there. But that couldn't be right. What would she be doing there? Oh, and she really can't forget to tell some pony about
Filthy Rich.
She literally just remembered about how she had given him quite the beating.
No, not Filthy. Maybe it was her brother.
I mean, he was in the hospital after all, too. Did she break her legs hurting her big brother?
That would be awful. He could take it, though. He's tougher than dried leather. She wondered why her legs were bandaged up, though.
She felt fine. Maybe she wasn't even supposed to be here. Applejack attempted to get up,
but found she'd been restrained to the bed. What in tarnation?
Applejack whispered angrily to herself, pulling on the straps that held her down. What was this?
Some kind of joke? And who in the hoof bandaged her legs like that? Was something wrong with them?
Having a little trouble there?
Who's there?
Applejack snapped, looking around the empty room in confusion.
Maybe she needs a little assistance, brother of mine.
Flim and Flam. What are you two spineless, no-good, fast-talking hooligans doing here?
Whoa there, little missy.
Is that any way to talk to the ponies who can get you out?
Get me out? Out of what? Hey, what's going on here? Why can't I move?
Applejack asked, thrashing about.
If you've gone and done something, I swear.
Or you'll what? Buck us to death?
Now, brother. I wouldn't go taunting the crazy mare. She's killed a pony that way, you know.
Killed a pony?
Why, her own brother, too. Such a shame.
Oh, you leave my brother alone!
Applejack screamed.
She turned to the restraints on her right hoof and pulled as hard as she could, trying to get it free.
I always knew you were pathetic.
Trixie, what in the hay is going on here?
I had to see for myself. Poor little Applejack, beating the tar out of her own kin.
I've done no such thing!
Then how do you explain the broken legs?
Applejack looked down at her legs in confusion. Why were they bandaged?
Did she get hurt?
Why couldn't she remember?
I'm sure a taste of our famous tonic will cure what ails you.
Guaranteed to put you back on your hooves or your money back.
Maybe she deserves to be like this.
Applejack.
So, what I'm thinking is going on right here is the combination of the pre-exhaustion prior to taking the potion, and then the combination of the exhaustion from being on the potion while already being pre-exhausted is causing the hallucinating and the memory fog to both combine into massive hysteria. Like, she is going crazy right now. She's absolutely losing her mind.
Growled and pulled again at the restraints on her hoof. When she couldn't make any progress, she decided it was time for a last resort. She bit down on the restraint and tugged it with her teeth,
gnawing at it as best as she could. Applejack was feeling frantic. The room was becoming more and more overcrowded by the minute, and all these unfriendly faces were staring down at her as she struggled.
Get away! Get away, you hear? Get away!
Applejack screamed. She thrashed wildly, biting down harder at the restraint.
Pulling as hard as she was able.
Try some tonic!
Stay back!
Oh, come now, Applejack. It can't hurt to try. We'll show you.
It's easy.
Flynn said.
He poured the contents of the tonic over the restraint on her hoof. She felt a warm liquid pouring down her leg and turned up her nose at the scent. It reminded her of a rusted coin.
She pulled again at the restraint, and her hoof finally came free.
See that?
I don't need your tonic, and I definitely don't need you.
Now that she had one hoof free, she could easily unlatch the other. She pulled the IVs from her leg and leapt out of the bed.
Ew! Don't get that tonic on my perfect mane.
Trixie whined, standing back from Applejack. Applejack looked down at herself and noticed that Flim and Flam's tonic had somehow gotten all over her fur and was continuing to drip freely from her hoof.
What's in this stuff anyway? What'd you do to me?
Why, I didn't do a thing, young filly. I'm only a business pony after all.
You. I remember you.
She charged at him.
But he was still somehow able to dodge her advances.
It's just good business.
You were gonna take the farm.
Nothing you can do about that now, little lady.
Won't a bit.
Four ponies shuffled along the dismal white halls of Ponyville Hospital, and one bounced. Twilight fell behind and couldn't mask the tears of guilt and shame she felt for Applejack's condition. Once she learned what had happened, she knew she was to blame. Doctors had refused Applejack visitors for the first few days, trying to rein in her sanity. They contacted Twilight personally when they were medically stumped as to why she wasn't responding to their sedatives. Twilight pored over her notes, gleaming every detail that she had on the subject of the potion she had never mastered. Book after useless book was thrown in disarray, while she and her friends waited to see their ailing friend. When the time had come at last, weeks after the initial incident, Twilight felt like nothing short of a complete failure. All she had learned was that the potion she had inadvertently created was robbing Applejack of her sleep, and there was no known cure. Pinkie Pie bounced happily in denial, paused at the door, and declared out loud,
We're here!
Hold on.
She turned to see the hopeful smile, and there was no known cure. Nothing shown in 2 days. Trying to rein in her sanity, they contacted Twilight personally, knew she was bounced. Twilight fell behind and couldn't mask the tears of guilt and shame she felt for Applejack's condition. Once she learned what had happened, she knew she was to blame. Doctors had refused Applejack visitors for the first few days, trying to rein in her sanity. They contacted Twilight personally when they were medically stumped as to why she wasn't responding to their sedatives. Twilight pored over her notes, gleaming every detail that she had on the subject of the potion she had never mastered. Book after useless book was thrown in disarray, while she and her friends waited to see their ailing friend. When the time had come at last, weeks after the initial incident, Twilight felt like nothing short of a complete failure. all she had learned was that the potion she had inadvertently created was robbing Applejack of her sleep, and there was no known cure. Pinkie Pie bounced happily in denial, paused at the door, and declared out loud,
We're here!
She turned to see the hopeful smiles from her friends, with the exception of Twilight, who hung her head in shame.
Come now, darling. I'm sure Applejack will forgive you. It was an honest mistake, and you were only trying to help.
Forgive me? She may not even recognize me. Terrible things happen to ponies when they don't sleep, Rarity. Some pony who has been awake this long has never been seen before, all else considered. Applejack should be dead right now.
Well, that's not very cheery. We're supposed to be cheery, remember?
It's not like we haven't run into these kind of problems before. You'll figure it out, Twi. And you will be fine.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Her friends knew it was a lie, and not a convincing one at that. But it was all the permission they needed to press onward. No pony knew what to expect when they opened that door.
And that is where I'm going to have to call this episode, guys. I will get right on part 2 of this as soon as I possibly can. But before we go, I will go over what I've already what I've covered so far. The drought, her big brother being in the hospital for heat stroke. We need to find out if he ever gets out. Twilight claimed she didn't have or didn't know all the side effects and whatnot, but apparently has multiple books on the subject and has just not mastered it. So it's basically a failed potion, and she knew that, giving that to Applejack. Because if she had books on the subject, she knew it wasn't effective yet. And yet she still chose to mention it and chose to give it to Applejack. So she is in all rights to feel like shit right now. We've also established that both of her back legs were broken, and yet she's still figuring out a way of, being able to manage to use them, because of one of the potion's side effects being pain loss, like you can't feel pain. And with her hallucinations originally starting at Filthy Rich, they've grown from being just a Filthy Rich to being a massive hallucination of basically just hate and anger towards her situation and her confusion and her mixed memories, all causing it to just kind of explode in her head. And basically what had happened to her on the hospital bed was her mentally breaking. It was her sanity basically finally ebbing away, and it was her insanity taking over. And with that being the case, she now cannot establish what is reality and what is a hallucination. So with that, she swore an undying vengeance against Filthy Rich when he challenged her, to not being able to do anything about it. Which is what I'm going to assume causes her to go into this frenzied state, is what I would call it. And I also want to just cover the fact that she was apparently in the hospital for weeks before she was able to escape, because they said that they kept her in there for a few days to try and rein in her sanity, and then it was weeks before Twilight was able to try and, finally establish the fact that she was a failure at this, and basically it's all her fault. But, So that's what we've covered, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the episode of Creep Tales Reviews. So, have a good one, guys.